Please rise for the gospel acclamation. The Holy Gospel according to Luke. The Sadducees, who do not believe in the resurrection of the dead, try to trap Jesus. They formulate the convoluted case of a serial widow who marries a succession of 7 brothers. Jesus responds by teaching about God, to whom all are alive and in whom all relationships are fulfilled. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up the children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the third married her, and so in the same all 7 died childless. Finally the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her." Jesus said to them, "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living. For to him all of them are alive." The Gospel of the Lord.
Good morning. Things you should never say once without thinking twice. It's no trouble at all. We have plenty of room. Call me anytime. Is there anything I can do? Of course, bring the kids. If worse comes to worse, you can use mine. Don't worry, there's more where that came from. Over my dead body, you will. The text this morning is Psalm 17. Psalm 17 is a prayer. Not only is it listed as a prayer in the title, but you can see throughout the text how David appeals directly to God. As we go through this text, you will see that David's life is an open book to God. I hope that through this study, we too can be an open book before God. In verses 1 through 5, David desires to be a man of integrity before God. In these verses, David takes great pains to express his integrity before God. Right off the bat, he says, "Hear, O Lord, my righteous plea." He indicates that his prayer does not rise from deceitful lips. He acknowledges that God has thoroughly examined, probed, and tested him. He acknowledges that his integrity is true, both in word and deed. And I dare say that the mouth is one of the big culprits when it comes to committing sin. With our mouths, we are quick to judge, to cut, to hurt, to lie, to gossip, to tear down. Did you know that the average person spends 1/5 of his or her life talking? If all of our words were put into print in one day, those words would fill a 50-page book. Think about that for a moment. Would your book be put on the fiction shelf? U.S. News and World article printed in 1994 did a long-term study of married couples, comparing what their relationships were like the first 10 years of marriage. They found that marriages of people who were happily married for many years versus those who were unhappy and got divorces, the relationships were very similar. They had the same number of fights. They both expressed the depth of their love for each other. Many factors were nearly the same, except one thing stood out. Couples who were happily married, only 5 out of every 100 comments were considered put-downs. Couples who later separated had 10 comments out of every 100 that were put-downs. And as the years went by, the put-down ratio got even worse from couples who would later separate. Obviously, this has ramifications within our relationships with our spouses, but we need to look at our relationship with our other family members, with people within the church. Are our words building up or tearing down? Are we encouraging or discouraging? In verse 3, David said, "I have resolved that my mouth will not sin. As for the deeds of men, by the word of your lips, I have kept myself from the ways of the violent. My steps have held to your paths, my feet have not slipped." David basically opens up his life to God's close scrutiny, and he does it without fear. I wonder if we would be able to have the same openness before God that David does. I'm inclined to believe that perhaps we would be a little nervous about God looking very closely at our lives, at our words and our actions. Is your life an open book before God? Are there parts of your life you try to hide? Are we willing to allow God to probe and examine me at night? David's deep desire was to be a man of integrity before God. Hopefully, we have the same determination and desire in our hearts, and that we can get to the point where we feel comfortable opening up all of our lives to God's inspection. In verses 6 through 12, David expresses to God that he is in danger. He has enemies. The temptation is to respond to our enemies in the same way that they attacked us. But remember, from the words of Jesus, we are expected to turn the other cheek. David doesn't put his faith in his own ability to fight his enemies. David's faith is in God. In verse 8, David uses some rather striking and strange language. "Keep me as the apple of your eye." This figure of speech is used elsewhere in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32:10. In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. This refers to how God found the children of Israel and regarded them as the apple of his eye. David sensed that God greatly loved and cared for him and regarded him as the apple of his eye. Also in verse 8, "Hide me in the shadow of your wings." This figure of speech pictures a mother bird caring for her young. There is no safer place for the defenseless, helpless baby bird than under its mother's wing. This phrase is found at least 10 times in Scripture. One of the most emotional phrases is in the words of Christ himself. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Matthew 23:37. In verses 13 through 14, David turned to God when he was in danger, and it was God who brought David deliverance. It is important to mention that there are different types of deliverance, and sometimes it is actually God's will that we go through difficult things along the way. I came across something on the internet that I want to share with you. A stranger stopped by the other day with an offer that set me thinking. He wanted to know if the old barn in the field was for sale. I told him right off that he was crazy. He was a city slicker. You could tell by the clothes he was wearing, his car, his hands, and the way he talked. He said he was driving by and saw the beautiful barn sitting out in the field. I told him he had a funny idea of beauty. Yes, it was a handsome building in its day, but after many winters of snow, ice, and howling winds, and summer sun beating down on that old barn, the paint was gone and the wood had turned silver gray. The old barn was leaning a good deal, looking kind of tired, yet that fellow called it beautiful. That set me to thinking. I walked out to the field and just stood there, gazing at the old barn. The stranger said he planned to use the lumber to line the walls of his den. He said, "You couldn't buy paint that beautiful. Only years of standing in the weather, storms, and scorching sun, only that can produce beautiful barn wood." It came to me then. We're a lot like that, you and I. Only it's the inside that the beauty grows with us. Sure, we turn silver gray too and lean a little bit, but the good Lord knows what He is doing. As we grow older, enduring the hard wealth of our lives, the dry spells and the stormy seasons, He's doing a job of beautifying our souls. And to think how often folks holler that they want a life easy. They took the old barn today and hauled it off to beautify a rich man's house, and I reckon someday you and I will be hauled off to heaven. Like the seasoned barnwood is used to beautify a home, the hard seasons in our lives will surely bring a little bit of beauty in heaven. When the danger comes, God is there. And when we can have faith that when deliverance is needed, deliverance will be provided. And when perseverance is needed, perseverance will be provided. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond that you can bear. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Finally, in verse 15, we see that David has his eyes focused on the fuller life to come. In the words of John Newton, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Are you focusing on the storms around you? Are your eyes on the prize? David's desire is to be an open book before God. He knows that when he lives in the center of God's will, he is the apple of God's eye. And in spite of any dangers that he faces, God will provide just what is needed for David to persevere and make heaven his home. What about you? Is your life an open book? Are you keeping your integrity in spite of dangers and trials that you are facing? Are your eyes fixed on Jesus? Open your eyes, look within. Are you satisfied with the life you're living?